All right. Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining this session. Got to get volume down a little bit, maybe. But this is leveraging declarative tools for more productive programming. So hopefully you're all here for this. I think it's going to be a great session. You'll learn a lot. We're going to talk about, you've probably been to sessions before where we've talked about clicks, not code. We're going to talk about clicks and code. So the idea here is, how can you make use of the declarative tools we have, whether it's Flow or Process Builder or anything else, so that you can free up your time to write better code for the things you really need to write code for, as opposed to things you can do declaratively. So my name's Adam Shunn. I'm a success specialist here with Salesforce. I may have done some accelerators. Accelerators are short engagements that we do to help customers come up to speed with things like Sales Cloud, Service Cloud. I happen to be a platform and governance specialist, delivering accelerators around those areas. So forward-looking statements, you've probably seen this slide a lot in the last 2 days, but just want to bring it up again. I may mention some things like DX or something else. So please make all purchase decisions based on what we have available today, not what's coming in the future. The agenda, we're going to look at understanding requirements. Once you know what your requirements are and you have a process, what do you do with that process? We're going to talk about clicks and code as opposed to clicks, not code. And we'll talk about clicks before code. So as much as you can, try and build something out declaratively before you turn to code as your last resort. And then we're going to talk about choosing the right tools for the job. So what is the right tool? How do you determine what the right tools are? There's different use cases for each tool. And depending on what you're trying to achieve, you're going to decide which tool is going to make the best of that process to make it happen. And then we'll wrap it up. And if we have time, we'll do some Q&A. So you've got your requirements, and a lot of times people get requirements, and their first reaction, especially if they're new to Salesforce, is I just want to build. Let's log in, let's start building. And especially if you come from a shop that used to be where you built everything from scratch, the first instinct is to write code. Let's write Visualforce pages, let's do Apex code, let's write a trigger, let's write a class. It's not necessarily the best thing. So before you do anything, whether it's configuration or customization, you want to kind of put a stop to everything in your requirements. So things phrased on how to do it inside of Salesforce are not a requirement. So the example here, create a checkbox to capture the different time zones to track when it applies to the contact. So that's not a requirement. It tells us what we're trying to achieve, but it by itself is not a good requirement. So design is not a requirement. So don't assume that the requirements are complete when you start building something. So the requirements are something you're going to design to, but they're not necessarily your design, and don't let the users necessarily dictate to you, which I've seen happen a lot on my projects, what they want the design to be. They'll say, I want this to be a checkbox, I want a pick list here, I want this there, and they'll try and design a system for you. Don't let them do that. You can be polite about it, but look at the requirement and get down to what the process actually is, as opposed to just taking from them what that design is going to be. Understand the business problem. So what's that business problem? Understand what they're trying to achieve, what their goals are with the business problem, and how are you going to build something with Salesforce, either through configuration or customization, that's going to help them solve that business problem. And then understand the process from end to end. So what starts the process? What's the first step in the process? How do you move through that process? And what's the end point of that process? At what point is that process finished? And they can say, we started this, whether it's Service Cloud and it's intaking a case, how do you handle a case? Or Sales Cloud and it's tracking an opportunity from conversion from a lead all the way through to closed won or closed lost opportunities. So once you have that process, you want to get that by asking open-ended questions to better understand the process from the users. You don't want to ask yes-no questions necessarily. You want to ask questions from them about what's currently not working. If they have an existing system that you're transferring off of, you're moving forward with, or even if you're doing a reboot, a Salesforce 2.0 or something else, find out what's not working for those users. and then have them describe to you what that process is. What are you going to then try and automate? So have them walk you through the process. If it's a salesperson, sometimes you can do that ride-alongs. I know if you're in a service desk, you have those, I can't remember the Y cords, so you can sit in on listen to calls to help them out. Whatever you can, understand that process. Understand what your entry criteria is. So what's going to start that process? What's going to kick it off? So for instance, for opportunities, it may be when you convert a lead. Or for you, the entry process may be when the lead comes in. Maybe the lead's coming in from Pardot. Maybe it's coming in from a list or an event like this where you've captured who knows how many leads and you're importing them into the system. What are the activities? So what are the activities they need to do in that process? So for each step of that process, they need to make phone calls, they need to set up events, they need to do callbacks. How are they going to do that? And then who completes the activities for the process? So who are the users? Who are the personas that are actually acting out this process and going through it? And if it helps, sometimes process maps, if you use Visio or something similar to Visio, where you can actually have swim lanes, and you can map a process across different swim lanes. So each swim lane would represent a persona or a person, and you can show who's doing which step in that process. And then include variations. So when we talk about variations, it could be, for instance, getting from one stage to the next in an opportunity or in a campaign or something else. Your process may have variations. So if the customer says, let's do this, or let's do X, well, what's Y? What are the alternatives, and how does the process differ if they choose an alternative, or if the user does something differently than what was normally expected? So the ideal thing is to have your clicks and your code natively living together. So what you want to strive for is anywhere from 0 to 20%. The closer to 0, the better. But there's always places where you just can't do it. You try, and we'll talk in a little bit about some of the tools that you can use, but there's nothing that really fits what you're doing declaratively and out of the box, so you are going to use some code. So if you use that code, you want them to be happy together. So your clicks and code, you want them to support each other. You want them to work together so that it makes your process smoother and more efficient. So what can be automated when we're looking at Salesforce? Any key business challenges, those can be automated. When you're looking at what those key business challenges are, coming up with automation for that and how you're going to handle it is something you can do. Your biggest pain points, and that's a large one. So talk to your users, find out what their challenges are, what those pain points are, and then think of a way using the tool how you can solve that problem for them. Manual steps in the sales process. This is a big one for anybody that uses has sales. So any steps that you're using Excel for, you're using Word documents for, where things are done manually, how can you take those processes and make them automated so that the users aren't doing that manually anymore? Processes that occur more than once over time. Approval processes. So for people that have to approve or not approve certain tasks, maybe it's a discount on an opportunity that needs to be, if it's over 10 or 15%, it needs to be approved by a VP. Anything like that is something that can be automated with Salesforce. So some of the tools we have, and I'm sure you've worked with some of these, if not all of them, workflows work very well if you have a single if-then statement. You're doing updates to records. If you want to do outbound messaging to another system, workflows are a great tool to do that. So workflows can go ahead and send an outbound message to an external system. They can kick off some other event, whatever you need to do with workflows. They can also send out emails. They can create tasks. They can update individual fields based on something that happens in the system when somebody changes the value of a pick list or somebody changes the value of a particular field. Process builder. So if you have multiple if-thens. So if it's a more complex piece, think of process builder as a way to connect multiple workflows together. So before you were creating one workflow, it was doing something. Well, now you've got a process that needs multiple workflows. You've got multiple if-then similar to when you're writing code, if-then-else statements. So if something happens, then this has to happen, else something different's going to happen. For scenarios like that, Process Builder is a great tool. It'll also let you create records using Process Builder and update related records. Visual flows. So visual flows work really well. I don't know how many of you have used or need to use wizards, but if you want to create a wizard for your user, one place I find them to be very helpful is in a call center situation where they start a call and the wizard can actually walk that user through the steps they need to take and fill in the details for that call until they get to the point where they can take the call and they know what the problem is and they're going to move forward with that. Triggers, Apex, these are going to be fired after different events. There's 7 different events that can cause a trigger to fire. The one thing we always recommend when you do your write triggers, you want to have 1 trigger per object. A lot of people write a after update trigger, then they'll write an after create trigger, then they'll write a delete trigger. There's no reason to write a separate trigger for every one of these events. You want to create 1 trigger that can handle all of these events. You can create supporting classes behind that trigger that can be called out so that you don't end up with a trigger that's a mile long in terms of the amount of code. But you're going to create that class behind it to support it. But the actual trigger that's going to sit on that object is going to be 1 trigger per object, which is the best practice. So here we're looking at workflow rules. These are going to be used for building workflow rules. Some examples here: contact a customer before their contract expires. So you can have a time-dependent workflow that's going out and scanning the contracts, and when a contract's coming up to a certain termination date, it can send an email or it can create a notification or a new task for that sales agent. You can assign a credit check task for a new customer that has to be done, notify a sales VP of top accounts, set a default opportunity name. There's a lot of things. Workflows have been around for a while. They're very powerful. The one thing you want to make sure you're aware of, though, when you're building workflows is keep track of what your limits are for the addition of Salesforce you have. I have gone to a lot of customers that are over the limits and had to ask for additional workflow rules. So before you get to that point, you want to investigate other tools. So if you do have that many workflow rules, then you want to go ahead and check out Process Builder, Visual Flow, and some of these other tools that are available to you. Approval processes. How many of you are using approval processes today for something? Okay, a fair number. So approval processes are great for things like I mentioned before, approving a discount on an opportunity. They can also be used for, we use it internally for approving our expenses. So for me to come here, I'm from New Jersey. So for me to come here from New Jersey, I had to put in the request for the travel expenses, and that went through an approval process that went up to my VP, and ultimately he approved it, and once it was all approved, I was able to go ahead and purchase my travel. Process Builder, if you want to create a draft contract record and associate it to an opportunity account, Process Builder can do that. It can congratulate an opportunity owner by posting something to a chatter group. Some other examples here. Notify VP of sales via email when something happens. Maybe an opportunity is closed won. Maybe a certain discount level has been approved. Maybe a renewal has happened and you're letting them know about that. You can create follow-up tasks and schedule them to execute 6 days after the opportunity close date. So if you have an opportunity that closes on a certain date, and based on the close date of the opportunity, something has to happen, and either the salesperson, the AE, or VP, and executive, somebody needs to reach out to that customer now that we've closed that deal, you can set up these dependent workflow, or these processes. They're going to go ahead and create the activities to make that happen. And then visual workflow. As I said, visual workflow is great for creating wizards. It can also do complex logic branching, going back and forth. So if you have any more complex processes that have different outcomes and different branches and go in different ways, visual workflow gives you a great way. It's got a very good, for any of you who've used it, it's got a very good interface for kind of dragging and dropping and building out what that's going to look like. You can use it if a case is escalated. You can check the account region and route it to a tier 2 team, so to a regional support team. And after an opportunity is closed won, you can calculate the discount and apply it to all the related opportunity products on a particular opportunity. And the last thing one it could do, as I mentioned before, you can build a wizard to collect customer information. And those wizards are very powerful. They work well with leads. They work great with cases. That's where I see them used the most with Service Cloud. But those wizards that you can create are very neat little things that can kind of step a user through the process to collect the right information that they need to collect in a certain step in a task or a process. So a little more on workflow rules. A workflow rule is a set of instructions. You're going to create a workflow rule, and here we can see an example of a workflow rule. We've got the rule. It's got some evaluation criteria. It's going to happen every time a record is created and any time it's edited subsequently where it meets the criteria. And you can set up different rule criteria. You can set up email alerts. These are going to consist of standard set of tasks and recipients for an email. You can do field updates. So maybe you want to set an update to a status field based on something else that's happened. As I mentioned, you can send outbound messages. So these are going to send messages to designated endpoints. And these could be external systems. You can kick off something that way. Maybe you're going to kick off a process in that external system. Maybe it's your ERP system. And once you close a deal, you're going to send that closed won information off, and that other system is going to pick it up, and it's going to start the contract process. And you can create a task. So create a task for your users. Maybe they need to do a follow-up call. Maybe you move an opportunity to a certain stage, and once it hits that stage, the next step is to set up a meeting. Whatever that is, that can create that task for you. Approval processes, these are going to go a little further. So when you create an approval process, it's going to let you specify a sequence of steps to approve a record. When you create these approval processes, you can make the approvals happen sequentially, where, for instance, it has to go to your director, the director has to approve it, then it has to go to the VP, then it has to go to the CEO even. Whatever that process is, it can happen sequentially, or you can make them parallel approvals, where they don't have to happen sequentially, but all the approvals have to happen, or you can tell it, we only need one of these approvals to go through for it to be finally approved. You can route these to individuals or to queues, and you can use dynamic routing through Process Builder or Apex, and you can also process approvals via email now. So whoever you are, if you're the approver, you can get an email telling you so-and-so. So for example, my manager could have gotten for my travel an email that said I put in a request for travel for this event, and by email he could have approved it or not approved it. Also, as I mentioned, you can enable parallel approvers. So if you wanted to, for instance, my manager and my VP wanted to approve at the same time, or not sequentially, I just needed them both to approve, we could have set them up parallelly. Process Builder. Process Builder is going to give you a user-friendly graphical representation. We can see the example here of what it looks like. We've got a start. So this is going to look very much, for any of you that worked in Visio or have developed process maps or anything else, they should look very familiar to you. You've got a start and you've got a finish. You're going to create your process using this layout. It's all point and click. There's a panel we can't see that'll be on the left side that lets you drag these items over and assign tasks to them. You can design the entire task, the entire process in a single place, and you can collaborate with different teams in your organization to create this process. So you can go across teams, and it lets you automate things that normally you used to write Apex code for, but now you can do these with Process Builder. Visual workflow, this is going to automate a business process by building flows and distributing them to the right users of the system. So we talked about the wizards. The wizards are one thing that's great about this, and a flow can execute logic. It can interact with Salesforce database, call Apex classes, and collect data from users. And you use this using the Flow Designer, which is another graphical interface, so it's all point and click. Takes a little bit, is probably a little more complex than the other tools to get used to, but once you get used to it, you'll find that it's very powerful and it provides you a lot of benefits. So here we're talking about automation tools versus complexity, and we can see kind of the continuum of where these tools come into play and where we're going to end up writing code. So if we look at the bottom level, low complexity, we're using workflow rules and approval processes. So these workflow rules and approval processes are easy to create, they're not too complex, and they really can do quite a bit, especially when used in conjunction with each other. As you move up through the continuum, you get to the low medium complexity. There we're looking at process builder. So now we're going to use process builder. Maybe the processes are a little more complex than what we were looking at with workflows and approvals, and we need to string together multiple things, multiple, as I said, multiple workflows, multiple tasks, multiple things need to happen. We're going to use process builder for that. From there you move to the medium to high complexity. Now we're talking about visual workflow, and once you get past that and you get to a very high complexity process where some things need to happen that none of these tools fit, that's where you're going to write your triggers and your Apex code. So how do you know what tool to use? Here's some points on when to use workflow rules, when to use process builder, and when to use visual workflow. And again, if you go through the process and you say, none of this is going to work for me, then that's the point where you start looking at classes and triggers. So if you're looking at workflow rules, if it's a standalone process that requires an email or a task to be created, that's where you would use a visual workflow or a workflow rule. Visual workflow when you need to create non-related records based on a process. So records that will be created in an object other than the object that the task is happening in, you could do that with visual workflow. Again, if none of these things are going to fit your process, whatever that is, and you're going to be working and trying to figure it out, that's the point where now you're going to start considering, how do I write code, whether it's like an Apex class or a trigger, to support this process. This is just a comparison matrix, so you can see here the differences between them. As we look at the red, we can see the visual workflow is the only thing that fits those three tasks. So when we're creating cross-object, non-related records, update fields on related records, or deleting records, visual workflow is the only tool of these that'll do that. Some additional tips and tricks here. Draw out your business process before building automating it. As I said, if any of you have used Visio or any tools like that, it really does help to document that process. Use swim lanes. If it's an integration, you may want to use swim lanes for the different systems. If it's going across different personas, so it starts with a particular type of user, and then it goes to another group of users or another user, and then finally it ends up with a third group, use swim lanes to represent those and show how the tasks cross over between one person and the next. Before you begin, check the type of field you want to update. Read-only fields, formula, auto number are not available for field updates. Process naming, so keep it short, precise. If you have any kind of governance in place, you should have a standard naming convention. So figure out what that naming convention is going to be and make sure everybody that creates processes stands by and uses that same naming convention. And then continue to update your description as you clone and modify the processes. So if it's code, hopefully you're writing your code well and you have a block at the top of every piece of code that has a description of what that code is. If there's changes to it, there should be the name of the developer or their initials and a date and a short description of what that change is. Same thing can happen with all these tools. So as you update things and you change things, make sure that it's noted and documented. And then minimize the amount of processes per object. So take advantage of the ability to create multiple processes. Again, if you're looking at, say you have a limit of 50 workflows and you're coming up to 53 or 52, see if you can take some of those and move them over to Process Builder. and move them out of your workflows. It'll help you from hitting your limits, and it'll also maybe even make it more efficient and easier to work with. Some resources you can get to, the Success Journey Hub, so salesforce.com/getting started provides a lot of links and a lot of good helpful areas. Platforms and apps, so you got Trailhead, which hopefully you've all done some Trailhead while you've been here and done Trailhead before you got here. White papers, you can find lots of good white papers up there on best practices around using these tools. Circles of Success, if any of you have done those are great. They give you a lot of information, and you get to collaborate with other users and find out what other users are doing related to that particular problem that circle's about. And then accelerators. I mentioned I'm a specialist. I deliver accelerators. If you are a Premier or Premier Plus customer, work with if you have a success manager. If not, work with your AE. But these accelerators are great tools to really get you up and running on a particular area. And we've got about a few minutes left, so are there any questions? Okay. What's that?
For testing, do you still write Apex test classes to test all of these different process types?
You don't need to write test classes for the process types. You write the test classes for your Apex.
Yeah, I was asking if you also write them for these other...
For like Process Builder and... So the question was, do you need to write test classes for Process Builder and these other tools? You don't need to write test classes for them, but you may want to do some testing of them, if that makes sense. You don't need to write code, you don't need to write test classes, but you're definitely going to want to write some use cases and user stories. They're going to go through and make sure that the process is functioning correctly. Yeah. Sorry, I don't have a microphone. Oh, there's one.
My question's around Process Builder. So is it more efficient to condense it to one Process Builder and have like all of those nodes go down that, or manage it from like 10 separate Process Builders? I'm more worried about like latency issues as to how that's actually executing.
But what issues?
Latency issues, like execution times for the Process Builders.
Yeah, it's a tough question only because when you link too many together, you could run into some limit issues in terms of the time it takes for things to happen. But it's a good idea to link a few together. But if you're looking at 15, 20, you may want to break them out a little bit.
I was just told that best practices is to use Process Builder or automation rules, but not both at the same time. Is that right?
Process Builder or
I'm new to Salesforce.
That's okay.
Excuse me. Process Builder or the older workflow rules. Thank you. Workflow rules.
I haven't heard that.
Okay.
But
because I had some concerns about concurrency issues.
yeah.
And what I was told that Process Builder basically instantiates a workflow behind the scenes, and then it competes with the other existing workflows, and you can't guarantee any kind of order of execution or anything like that.
Right, and that's correct. I haven't heard that it's best to pick one over the other and stick with it, but you are right. Order of execution doesn't necessarily, especially if there are multiple workflows firing, you don't know when they're firing, so you could end up creating a redundancy where one updates a field and that triggers the other one, then that one updates the field and it triggers the Process Builder again, and so you could go back and forth. But I haven't heard it's best practice to choose one over the other and stick with it. So, what's that? How do you avoid it?
Yeah.
Yeah, just with testing. So there's not, and documentation. So there's not a tool or anything that'll tell you that there's a conflict. So you're really going to have to just go in and make sure that that they're not triggering each other, that you're not getting into I'm trying to think of the word, but you don't want to kill your system by putting in something that's going to continuously trigger itself over and over. Anything else? No? Oh, yes.
today when we use the process builder, once you make the change and then test it out, and if you want to make any changes to that, the only way is to clone it and then do it. Is there any way that do you guys have any plans in the future to not create that many clones unnecessarily, and just to update the existing process builder and make it work?
To update the.
The process builder. So right now, once you activate it, you can't do any modifications to it until you clone
Right.
it and then create it. But during the development time, you may be doing want to make many changes to see really what you really want the process builder to do. So is that the only do you guys have any roadmap like not to create that many clones and update the same process builder to make it work?
I don't know the answer to that,
Okay.
but give me your contact information when we're done here, and I'll try and find that out for you. So, thanks. All right, well, looks like we're just about out of time. So I'll be around here for a little bit. Thank you very much. Hopefully you learned something, and this was a good session, and I enjoyed it. So enjoy the rest of the conference.